I'm going to talk about what React is, how to use it, and why I think it's really cool versus some of the other options out there, and a little bit about how it works. So building user interfaces is hard. We have this constant problem where people will build their components their own way. So I will build it this way, someone else will build it another way, and it's the exact same thing. People try to use or be consistent by using like a template library or a design spec or something like that, but it's actually really hard for everyone to get on the same page. So React is a different way of thinking. It's a library for building user interfaces with JavaScript. It doesn't do anything else because it aims to be simple. Its goal is to focus on the user interface, and that's it. It doesn't care what your technology stack is. It could be Backbone, it could be Ember, it could be anything. And the way it works is that you should be expressing how your app should look at any given time. And React actually will manage all of those changes for you. So when your data changes, it will automatically update, and you don't have to worry about digesting a scope or updating the DOM yourself or anything like that. And React is declarative. So how it works is conceptually it will hit a refresh button and refresh your entire application given the new data that it currently knows about. So the way it does this is by using components. It doesn't use templates at all, so there's no handlebars or mustache or anything like that. And the reason that this is powerful is that it uses JavaScript to generate or to build your UIs. So you have the full power of JavaScript, the flexibility of JavaScript, and you can actually add a lot of abstraction using JavaScript that you don't get using handlebars or mustache or any of those other client-side templating languages. So I'm going to show a quick demo.
You're closing.
What's up?
And the Wi-Fi.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So this is how you define a component in React. I'm using Node, and this is what React will actually generate for you. And I'll go over a little bit about JSX and probably use that for the rest of these demos. But for now, this is how you build your components. So all this is saying is that from the DOM, I want to build an H1. I'm not going to have any attributes on this particular element, and I want to append it to the document's body. So let's go to here. And then we will sorry, it's not working. Oh, I know why. You actually have to tell it to render because right now it doesn't know what to do. So this one actually, we want to say, I got that backwards, sorry guys. This is the content for that particular element, and this can be other components, it can be just text, it can be any kind of actual node that you want to render inside of the H1. This is what actually tells the screen to render this particular component and attach it to the document's body. So now if we refresh, you can see we have hello. So it's a very simple component. Okay, so the nice thing about this is that you can actually compose your components to build very complex user interfaces. So let's take an example. This is a product item in a list from Amazon. And the goal when you're thinking about how to build this using React is to break it down into multiple components. So if we do it something like this, you can see we have the entire thing, which would be a product listing component maybe, and that is composed of a product image, the title, which includes this title and the 2014 and the rating, and maybe you have these two, which are the exact same component, an upsell type option. You have your reviews and some product specs, and then maybe you have this trading component that you have for different items, the product description, and then the product category with more options. So I'll show you how to do that, but I just want to talk a little bit about JSX because I'm going to be using that in the next demo. JSX is a JavaScript XML syntax. It makes writing your components a little bit easier because now you kind of think about it in a DOM-specific way. You kind of visualize it as a DOM language. And the way it works is it just uses a simple transform to take it from that XML structure and turn it into the code that you saw before with the react.dom.element type. And the nice thing about this is that designers can actually look at it and kind of conceptualize it and understand how it's going to look close to what it will render in the actual DOM. So let's do that. So we'll do hello. Okay, so we're just going to do the same thing. Okay, so one thing to note is that you do have to have this little pragma at the top in order for the React parser, the JSX parser, to transform this. Otherwise, you might run into some problems. If you don't want to do that, if you don't think that's dumb, then just use the DOM.js library and it will work just fine. Let's stop that. Another problem. Oh, see this one. Let's try this.
You have a left.
Oh. Okay, so this one is using JSX, and like I said, it's very simple syntax to use, and it's really easy to conceptualize how it's going to look in the DOM. There are some things that you have to be aware of when you are using JSX because it is JavaScript. It does get transformed into JavaScript, and so you have to be careful because you can't use certain things that you could use using HTML, because it will escape characters, so you can't use HTML entities unless you insert the UTF character code into your actual JSX. You could also use string.fromchar code in order to pass along the UTF code. Or you could use a method that they have, a function called dangerously set inner HTML, and then you can just insert it as you wish. Another thing to recognize is that attributes are not supported by the HTML spec. So if you want to add support, you can use data dash in order to get support for that. But all ARIA attributes are supported for accessibility. So that's another bonus. All right. So let's talk about component state. Most of your components probably should be stateless. You use the props in order to pass the data to the component to display on the screen. But sometimes you may want to use state. Maybe you're using a timer or something like that. And that's what we're going to build real quick. Okay. I will show you how to. That really sucks. PowerPoint is terrible at doing that. All right. Setting Sublime. Load time cycle 3. Okay. So let's create a detonator. So what we're doing here is we are saying that this is the initial state of this component. Every time you render, this is the state that you will start with. So let's see. I will go over what this is doing in a minute. And then we'll do this. So. So this is how you get state. And what we're doing here is component did mount. This is a function that's built into React. So what this does is right after the component renders, this function will fire. So all we're doing is we're setting an interval for every second to tick down. So what we'll do is we'll say if the actual time remaining is 0, we'll say this dot set state time remaining is boom. Else say this dot set state oh, thank you. Wait, what?
It's still time remaining.
Oh, thank you. Okay. And so what we'll do is we'll just say here we'll return div, and then we'll say this dot date dot time remaining. So, does anyone have any questions so far about what this is doing? I think this is pretty straightforward.
For time remaining to have the same name as the initial time remaining you're counting down with?
I'm sorry?
Wouldn't that be bad to be having the same name as the
Where?
variable you're subtracting?
Here?
Yeah.
So you're setting the property that you defined up here. So you're just resetting what the value is here.
Oh.
And because it's a JavaScript, we're just changing the value type at this point.
But then the next if you're going to try to subtract the one from the word boom.
It's not, because what we're going to do is, if it's 0, we're going to clear the interval. We'll say okay. And then we will render it to, always does that, to the body.
So is there a difference between setting like that interval property right on this rather than on the soft state?
So the way that React works is that it automatically will bind the this keyword properly, and I was going to get into that when we go over how events work. So this .interval will always be available to the tick function, because tick is bound to this, and then you will have that property available. You could put it in the state, but that's kind of not really necessary, because you're just saying that this is a property on the component itself, and you don't need it to do anything with. One more thing is that this is how you actually use properties, and anything you want to render that's on the component, you put them in this little brackets right here. So we'll save that. Hopefully it will go. I should make that bigger.
What do you want the differences between the state and this dot interval? Just did this dot state.
Boom.
Would it be
So
differently?
it would work the same. Like if you did want to say this dot set state interval and pass it along this, you could, but then you have to make this function call, and you have to remember that it's on the state, and then it's not really necessary.
Yeah.
It's just a property on the component at this point. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
The interval is just a property on the component. Isn't the state just a property on the? Isn't state just a property on the component also?
Yes, but you would, and I will get into that in just a second. So you guys saw that it's counting down, and then it went boom after it got down to 0. So you can think of this as like a way, if you wanted to fire an event after a certain amount of time or something like that, you could use this in that way. Okay. So what actually should you put in state? So any data that can be manipulated via a component's event handlers or user interactions, button clicks, or change events on a component, they can be manipulated, and so you should put that kind of data in your state. But when you're thinking about a component, try and think of it in the minimal amount of state as you can, and only store those properties in your state. Oops. Missed my mouse. Some things that you probably should think about before putting in state is computed data. So if you have like a list and you want to display to the user, 10 items in this list, some people would think about putting that into the state, but it doesn't need to be there. You just put that in your render function. And if you want to abstract that out, you can. You just put it into a different function that you would call in your render function. You should not put other components in your state, because that doesn't really make sense. And you would just put those in the render function as well. And then you also probably want to think before you try and duplicate data that is on your properties versus you don't want to duplicate your properties in state unless you know that it may change, and you need to know what its previous value was to make a decision. So let's talk a little bit about the lifecycle component we'll go through. So there are three different phases that a component goes through. It goes through mounting, updating, and unmounting. So in the mounting, there are three functions that you can utilize in order to set up your component. There's the get initial state, which we just used. The component will mount is another function that is immediately invoked before it mounts the component, and then component did mount, which you also saw is immediately after it mounts or renders in this case. So if you needed to do any kind of manipulation or decision making prior to the component rendering or right after it renders, you can utilize those functions. Updating. So there are a few functions that you can use. So component will receive props is a function that if the component is going to receive new properties, you can utilize that function to make decisions. Should component update is a really important thing that you can use to actually optimize your front-end code by making a decision because it receives what the old property was and what the new property is going to be. And you can determine, are these the same? If they are, I don't need to update. So just return, and I don't really have to do anything. It's used to warrant. You can use it to determine whether or not the component warrants a DOM change. And then you also have component will update and component did update, and that's the same thing as the mounting or rendering. It's right before it updates and right after it updates. You can do different things. And then unmounting, component will unmount. That's something you can use after the component is destroyed and right before the component is destroyed, and you can do any cleanup work, any event handling. For example, if you're using an event emitter or something like that, you can remove all those listeners in that type of method. Okay, so in React, there's a pretty big distinction that they make between component ownership versus being a parent. So if you have two components, X and Y, and component X uses component Y inside of it, they say that component X is an owner of component Y. And the way that it works is that the properties are consistent to what the parent sets them to. But the difference is, like, if you have a div with a P inside of it, that div is a parent of the P. So if you think about it that way, it's a little bit more easy to understand, and the owner is what should be making all the changes to the underlying components. So I'll just show a quick demo of that. So let's say we have so we have an item name or an item component that's just a list item. And this is kind of where you'll see the power of JavaScript coming in. So if you have, for example, property that has a list of items, you can use them to map to what you want it to be. So let's say we have a list of items, bar items equals an array, item 1, item 2, item 3. We'll say this dot props dot items dot map. Oops. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually return an item component, and we're going to say the item name equals the item. Actually, I'm going to do this part. Okay. So all this is doing is it's using JavaScript to map the items on the properties that you put and onto this component, and it's going to convert them into an item component. And then you can render that item component, or that list of items components. This will return an array, and you can render them inside of here. And then we will say we want an item list. The items to equal the items.
The props gives you access to any attributes you're passing.
Yes. Anything that you pass along using this syntax right here will be available to you using the this.props.
Let's see a close bracket on that.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have to require React?
Oh, yes, I do. I should just make this do that, but I forgot to.
So I guess that explains why React won't let you set other attributes that HTML doesn't support, because it's going to
Right, and you got to remember that it compiles down to JavaScript also. And so, yeah, we'll see what this does when we do that. So you can see we have a list of 3 items. So this is how you can sort of see how we're starting to compose UIs rather than building each individual thing. We build very small components, and you can put these all into a component library, for example, and start getting a more consistent UI that way. So that's a little bit about the ownership piece. All right, so you guys kind of saw how we did the data binding, only it's not really data binding. Traditional JS frameworks like Knockout or Angular or Backbone or anything that uses a templating language follow what's called the key value observation paradigm. And the way it works is it uses observables or computed properties to bind the data that you have to the UI. So when the data changes, it's bound to an underlying model that updates, and it has to manipulate the DOM in that way. And Angular uses dirty checking to determine whether or not it should update. Problem is that JS is not reactive, and the DOM is inherently stateful. And all data binding is a polyfill for reactive JS and the DOM. So when you use traditional data binding, you have to see what data change and then imperatively make changes to the DOM in order to keep it up to date. Even Angularjs, which a lot of people are really raving about now, it requires you to use directives and data binding, and it requires a linking function to manually update the DOM. So if we look at this example with a key value observation, when the data changes from LA and New York to LA, Chicago, and Seattle, how many DOM manipulations is that? Any guesses? 3. So you have 1 to remove New York, and then 2 to add new nodes for Chicago and Seattle. So React tries to solve that problem by using the virtual DOM. And they try to say that it's a less leaky polyfill for making JavaScript and the DOM reactive. So the way it works is that whenever something changes, you have your DOM that it knows about. It will re-render to a virtual DOM, and it's sort of like how Git works, is it will determine what the diffs are, and then only update the real DOM with those diffs. So with that in mind, can anyone guess how many DOM manipulations this one has? 1? 1. So it has 1 for changing or adding Seattle, and then all it does is it changes the inner node or the inner text for this particular one to be Chicago instead of New York. Does that make sense? So that makes it pretty fast in adding nodes and manipulating the DOM versus some of the other things, especially Angular that uses dirty checking, where if you have a lot of items, it gets really, really slow when you have to manipulate all of them. Okay, so events. They built in their own synthetic eventing system, and that's nice because every browser from IE8 and above will work. It's consistent with the W3 spec, and so you can use this. And this was built by Facebook and Instagram. I didn't mention that, but they still support IE8, and so this library will support all those old browsers using the synthetic event system. And like I said before, they use auto binding, so all of the events automatically bind to the component. So you don't have to call .bind and pass this, and you always have the right this keyword. And sort of the way it works is by using event delegation. Has anyone heard of event delegation with JavaScript at all? Okay. So if you have, for example, a list of items or a list of links, and traditionally what you might do is you would add a click event handler to each link in the list, but that's not what this does. What this does is it adds a event handler to the parent, and then when those things are added and removed, it has an internal mapping of those listeners and all the children. And so the parent is responsible for delegating the event to the correct item in the list. And so when you look at your node, you'll never see something like onClick equals run this function, and it's really fast because it just looks in the mapping as to which element you're currently working with. So I went through those. So let's go through a demo. So let's say we have a button. We'll actually give this a like button. Okay, and then we will create a function here called handle click, and we will say it's a function, and then we'll say initial state function. Okay, so this is a very simple component. Everything starts with 0 likes. Every time you click the button, you will increase the number of likes by 1, and then we will just create a couple of items, a couple things, cats, puppies, goldfish, just for example. And then we'll create another component really quick that will render all of these as like buttons. let's say for buttons dot likable things .map. We'll actually change this to props admin. Okay, does this make sense to everyone? So I'm going to say we want to like button list. And we'll say that likable things equals, come on. We're going to render it to the document.body. Actually, let's do one more thing in here. And we'll put something like this. Okay. So we will go and run this. Line 17. Well, I'll get rid of that. Oh, I know why. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is something I just forgot, but I should mention, because this all turns into JavaScript, you can't return more than one function. So I was trying to return the button and the strong. So you just have to wrap it in something in order to return one thing.
Have you ever looked at the JavaScript it compiles?
Yeah, I can show you in the dev tools. Let's try again. Now it looks like it's working. Okay, so we have cats liked 8 times. Does anyone like goldfish? No. People like puppies though, right? So you can sort of see how that we're handling these events. And just so you can kind of get an idea of what it's actually doing, you see how this has this data React ID. This is how it knows how to map the events. So like you have, this is the mapping that you're going to use. This is the first item in that mapping, the second item, and the third item in that mapping. And so this is what actually is handling those events. And it's just passing the event handler down to this particular button. So you can kind of get an idea. It's like this one is 0.1, this one is 0.2. And then just one other thing to keep in mind is that every child, you can give it a unique key to help prevent some funky things from happening. And I'll let you look at that yourselves. And then if we look at the bundle, let's see if we can, it's all the way at the bottom.
Is it doing that transform on the client side from your JSX to the bundle, or is that on the server side?
You can do it client side. I'm doing it server side. Come on. Can't grab
I'm
it.
guessing we would just do it during build.
Yeah, you would do that during build. Okay, actually that's even easier. So you can see right here, react.dom.ul, react.dom.div. It does all these transforms. I'm using Watchify and Browserify and Reactify to compile it all on the fly, so I don't have to have those particular things on there. Does anyone have any questions about?
If you want to add more attributes, how do you do that? You just add the initial state.
It depends on the attribute. You could do that using the props. So if we wanted to add an ID to this particular button, for example, all we would do is we would give it an ID equals this.props.id, and then we would say ID equals banana, and this would set the property, although it would look really bad because everything would have the same ID in this particular case, but you kind of get the idea. All right. So there are a couple of last-minute things that I kind of looked at. React has some add-ons specifically for manipulating classes a little bit easier for your components, and the React test utils is testing utilities for your components. They have ways to simulate the DOM events in your test so that you don't have to render it inside of a DOM, which is really nice. But I didn't really play with that too much. Yeah, I think it'd be really, really nice to actually use this. Building this was a lot more fun than using Angular. And I built a little more complex sample yesterday. So I just created some links that you guys can look at if you'd like to read the documentation. There's the GitHub link. Some of the tooling that's around it, the JSX parser for the client, and they also have a pretty extensive list of starter kits and shims for things like routing and all these other things, modeling your data and all that stuff, React Backbone, React, all that. And then this video is actually really, really good. Is Pete Hunt, who is one of the core contributors and maintainers of React, and he works for Facebook, I believe. And he kind of gives you a little more insight as to what they were thinking when they decided to build React, why they built it in this way, and the paradigm shift in why they decided not to use traditional data binding and things like that. And it's a really good video. It's about half an hour. Oh, okay. Does anyone have any questions? I want to see a more complex example. I have one more complex example that I built yesterday that I can show.
We have some time if you want to.
Okay, I'll show you that real quick.
So what's the difference between just a state and a property of this? State get like.
So a property is something that can't change unless you explicitly change it and re-render the component.
No, actually, I mean, what's the difference between just like going this dot number equals 5 versus going this dot sets state dot number.
So when you
5.
do the set state, that will automatically re-render that anything that uses that in the DOM. So like I said before, the virtual DOM gets all the diffs, and it determines if something changed based on whether you set the state or not.
Okay.
And so that's how it tells what differences were made.
If I'm not using that, I don't need the DOM re-render. I could just throw variables onto this.
Absolutely. And I'll actually, let me open up another example.
If I want to load the initial state from an AJAX request or something,
You could do that, absolutely. So you would set the initial state, and that might actually go, you would probably do that in your component will mount or your component did mount function, and send off the request to the server to get that data. And the nice thing about that is you can wait for that to return. So you know how Facebook, if you open Facebook and it has all of your timeline and they're not completely filled out right away, you can build that stuff really easily because you can say this is what the component looks like, and then when that AJAX request returns using like a promise or something like that, then you can render that stuff back into the state, or into the state of the component. Okay, so this is a little bit more complex. I'll just run this real quick, show you what it is. And then so, you know, we can add bananas, a ribeye, an apple. Nobody likes pork chops, especially when you can have a ribeye. So these are two separate components, and it's a little more complex because now we're talking not between a parent component and a child component, between two completely separate components. And the way I did that was using just the node events emitter. So you can kind of see we have a product here. When it gets this cart item added, or when the add to cart function gets run, all we do is emit this event out to whoever is subscribed, pass along the product ID. Here we're just listing out the products, pretty self-explanatory. And then we have a cart item, and this is kind of what I mean about not putting this kind of stuff into state. This calculate cart item total is outside of here, and you can use this in more than one component. So you can kind of see how you can actually pull all this stuff out into really small digestible modules and test them completely separately from your React components.
Isn't that a global function?
It is, but if you made this a module, it wouldn't be. It's global now, but it's fine.
You're using required.
Oh, when you use require, it makes it up global.
Require would, or you would
Require
just make this a common JS module or something like that, using module.exports, and make this an actual module that you could use. But you can see here, like this from char code is something I explained a little bit earlier. This is so I can. No, this is actually for what you call is a longer dash. So this dash right here. I don't know what happened to the $sign I had in front of here, but it's gone.
Do you have an example of like sharing files where you have one file that has your card stuff, another has your product stuff?
So this is like a good, not a great example, but this is just a products.json file that I'm requiring, and this just has the list of products. But using Browserify or Node, you can just create files, and locally you can use them in your application this way. So then here it's the same sort of thing. We start with no cart items, and then when the cart item is added, we'll update the cart. And this is just a function on this particular component. Trying to see if there's anything else interesting. One thing that you will notice is that in your return, you can't use conditions. You can use ternaries, but you can't use conditions because it just doesn't really work well. It gives you a little more explanation on their documentation as to why. But here we're just checking if you don't have anything, then your cart's empty. Otherwise, we want to render these cart items. And then like, same thing here, this calculate total, and all this is doing is using that other function that we defined earlier. And then we're rendering these components completely separately. We have a product list, we have a shopping cart, and you can see that they're rendered separately.
So if I include this sample 5.js into another file, then I get that function that was the calculation function.
You would not. So, no, unless I made this a module and exported that completely, you wouldn't get that. So the way it kind of works is, in order for you to get that, I would have to do module.exports equals calculate this. And this is what will give you that function in other places. No, this is a node thing. Node slash npm, all that. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Have you tried using it in like a form?
Was it server side or client side?
I didn't use any user input. There aren't a lot of major hurdles with that. There are a couple of things you have to be aware of. So text areas, for example, you can't use the inner HTML as the value of that particular text area. You set the value property on that component. They go into a little bit more. It's the same thing for like select lists and radio button lists on what's you would traditionally use checked, but everything uses value instead. Just one little thing you kind of have to keep in mind, but it doesn't seem too challenging.
And I'm guessing you would use one of those like will update or whatever for validation.
Yes, and you also
Will update, or
yeah, and you can also validate the property types using React. They have actual property type determination. So if you have an input type that has to be a number, it can validate that it is a number type on the input. So it gives you some niceties like that. But that's all I got, unless you guys have any other questions.
Were you doing this? Was this a server side or client side?
This is all client side. I was going to build something server side, but I decided not to because it's too much. Cool. Does anyone have any other questions? No? Cool.
pretty interesting.
I really like it.